He was once Europe's most feared monarch, a man who defied the Pope, destroyed monasteries, and married 6 queens. But by January 1547, King Henry VIII was a prisoner of his own body, grotesquely obese, crippled by ulcers, and stinking of infection. Courtiers whispered in dread as he rotted alive, trapped in a body collapsing under disease and decay. His final days were filled with silence, secrecy, and the terror of a monarch who could no longer rule himself. And even in death, Henry would not rest. His coffin leaked, his corpse became legend, and a prophecy cast him as England's cursed Ahab. This is the horrifying death of Henry VIII, the king who changed history, and whose end became a warning etched in blood and wrought. If you're ready for the untold, brutal truth of history's most infamous monarchs, subscribe now, because this is where history bleeds. By January 1547, Whitehall Palace reeked of something more sinister than politics. It smelled of a dying king. Henry VIII, once the muscular Renaissance prince who dazzled Europe, had become a swollen, immobile mass of flesh, confined to contraptions built to move his failing body from chamber to chamber. His legs, once strong enough to thunder down a tilt-yard on horseback, were eaten alive by ulcers so deep and foul that attendants gagged when the wrappings were changed. The court was a theater of silence. Nobles and servants alike walked carefully, not out of courtesy, but because every cough, every wince, every mutter might offend a monarch whose temper still burned hotter than his failing body. Henry's moods had grown volcanic, rage one hour, weeping the next, followed by long stretches of despair in which he lay trapped, staring at the ceiling, his enormous body a prison. He weighed over 28 stone, nearly 400 pounds, by the final estimates. His waistline, once admired for the athletic strength beneath it, ballooned past 50 inches. His legs could no longer carry him. Specially constructed hoists had to lift him in and out of bed. He was placed in wheeled chairs to shuffle across chambers, and even that required teams of attendants. To look upon him was to see not a God-anointed king, but a man consumed by his own excess. The ulcers were the worst. They were the legacy of that catastrophic jousting accident in 1536, when his horse crushed him into the mud and left him unconscious for hours. Since then, the wound had festered. By the 1540s, it was a grotesque spectacle. Open sores, inflamed and infected, leaked pus that soaked through bandages. The odor was so unbearable that physicians stuffed the chamber with herbs and spices in a futile attempt to mask the stench. Those who cleaned the wounds sometimes vomited. And yet, this rotting flesh was the body of the King of England. Sleep brought no relief. The ulcers throbbed, his heart labored, and his immense bulk made it nearly impossible to breathe when he lay flat. Some nights he barely slept at all, pacing in his mind while his attendants dozed in shifts. Fear hovered in the silence. What if the king died tonight? What if he lived long enough to lash out at those who presumed him weak? The political stakes made every groan of the king a matter of state. Henry's son, Edward, was a boy of just 9 years old. The regency that would follow Henry's death was a powder keg, with factions already circling like wolves. Who would control the boy? Who would control England? Every day Henry lingered in agony was another day of suspense for ambitious courtiers, who whispered behind closed doors while bowing in public. But even as his body rotted, Henry clung to the habits of a ruler. He still signed documents, still demanded reports, still lashed out when he sensed disloyalty. To the end, he tried to project majesty, though his flesh betrayed him. He was swaddled in silk and fur, yet underneath those layers, his legs were bound in bandages blackened by infection. The contradiction was grotesque power embodied in decay, magnificence hiding rot. Those closest to him feared more than the disease. They feared the king's refusal to admit defeat. The physicians of Whitehall urged him to consider confession and preparation for death. But Henry had spent a lifetime bending the church to his will. Now, as the shadows lengthened, he resisted bending himself to the rituals of dying. It was only in his final days, when Archbishop Cranmer was summoned, that the question of his soul pierced the suffocating air. Until then, Henry raged not at death itself, but at the indignity of being trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed. Outside Whitehall, the people heard rumors. The mighty king was seen less and less in public. Processions were cancelled. His absence in state ceremonies became obvious. Yet no proclamation acknowledged weakness. Officially, Henry VIII was still the hammer of England, still the man who humbled Rome, still the lion of the Tudor dynasty. Unofficially, he was a carcass in silk, decomposing before the crown could leave his head. When death finally arrived on the 28th of January 1547, it came as both a relief and a terror. Relief for a body that could no longer endure its own weight in poison. Terror for a court that now had to conceal the truth, at least long enough to choreograph succession. The king's body was sealed away as quickly as possible, packed into a lead-lined coffin. But death did not solve the problem of corruption, it only accelerated it. Within days, the corpse would betray itself. The last winter of Henry VIII was not merely the end of a king. It was the collapse of a myth. The man who once embodied power, virility, and divine kingship had been reduced to a festering ruin, wheeled around like a grotesque spectacle no one dared describe aloud. His reign ended not with a glorious final act, but with the putrid stench of a body in revolt. And yet, this was the monarch who had reshaped England, who had executed wives and ministers, shattered Christendom's unity, and left behind a dynasty now dependent on a sickly boy. The paradox is inescapable. Henry's personal decay mirrored the fragility of the state he left behind. Just as his body collapsed under its own weight, so too would England stumble under the burden of his legacy. Every tyrant has a turning point. For Henry VIII, it was not a council chamber or battlefield, but the tilted agree which on 24th of January 1536. The king who once thundered across Europe's courts in armor of gold and silver came crashing down into the mud, crushed by a horse, and rose from it never the same. That moment, an accident witnessed by courtiers, grooms, and horrified spectators, marked the slow destruction of his body, his reign, and his mind. Henry had been 44 years old, still convinced of his vigor, still jesting like the Renaissance prince he once was. But age and weight had already begun their assault. When his horse fell upon him, he lay unconscious for hours. Some feared he would never rise again. Anne Boleyn, his queen at the time, reportedly miscarried the male heir she carried upon hearing the news, convinced the king was dead. In a single day, Henry's body betrayed him, his dynasty trembled, and his personality darkened. The blow to his head likely caused severe traumatic brain injury. Accounts describe him lying, without speech, for hours. Modern clinicians suggest lasting frontal lobe damage, consistent with the explosive rages, paranoia, and erratic cruelty that dominated his later reign. This was no minor bruise. The king's brain itself may have been rewired that day, leaving behind the mercurial, suspicious tyrant remembered by history. But the more visible wound was in his leg. The crash reopened an older justing injury, leaving deep tissue damage that never properly healed. From that day forward, Henry carried an ulcerating wound on his left leg that became the defining physical torment of his life. At first, it was bandaged and drained. Physicians applied poultices, lances, and herbs. Yet every few months the wound flared again, swollen, infected, discharging foul pus. What began as a trauma injury metastasized into chronic disease. By the 1540s, the ulcers had spread and deepened. One leg became grotesquely swollen, wrapped daily in bandages that stained and stank. He could barely endure the pain. The constant infections likely poisoned his bloodstream repeatedly, weakening his heart and kidneys. This was long before antibiotics. Each flare-up risked sepsis, each dressing change a reminder of decay. His courtiers saw it, smelled it, and learned to mask their revulsion. The accident didn't just ruin Henry's body, it wrecked his way of life. The once athletic king, who hunted for days and jested tirelessly, was trapped in immobility. Exercise became impossible. His already rich diet, heavy on red meat, sugar, and wine, turned against him. He gained staggering weight, swelling to over 28 stone 100 kgs by his final years. The ulcers and the obesity formed a vicious cycle. The heavier he grew, the more his legs collapsed, the more he sat immobile, the deadlier his circulation became. His body was a clock winding down, and he knew it. Psychologically, the fall deepened his paranoia. A man who had once prided himself on strength now faced weakness he could not conquer. This humiliation fermented into rage. The executions of Cromwell, Catherine Howard, and countless nobles can be traced to this period of decline. When Henry lashed out at anyone he suspected of betrayal, his temper was no longer the sharp discipline of a ruler, it was the unstable fury of a man at war with his own flesh. The medical legacy of 1536 went beyond ulcers. Modern analysts suggest that the accident may have triggered endocrine and metabolic changes, possibly type 2 diabetes, hormonal imbalance, or Cushing's syndrome. The symptoms fit obesity, mood swings, slow healing, and erectile dysfunction. In short, the crash likely accelerated every weakness in Henry's body, making the last decade of his reign a slow motion collapse. Anne Boleyn's tragedy was part of this turning point. The miscarriage that followed the accident robbed Henry of what he wanted most, a surviving male heir. Within months, Anne herself would be executed, and Henry's desperation for succession grew sharper. Thus, the accident not only ruined his body, but indirectly shifted the political and marital course of England. From that year onward, Henry VIII was no longer the dazzling Renaissance prince painted by Holbein. He was a man battling chronic infection, ballooning weight, and unpredictable rages. The jousting field had broken him, and no physician could put him back together. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry had endured 11 years of slow rot from the wound that never healed. Courtiers still whispered of that fateful January day in 1536, when the horse fell and England's king was swallowed by mud. They knew what historians later confirmed: the accident was not just an event. It was the hinge of his reign, the point where glory tipped into grotesque decline. The horrifying end of Henry VIII, the ulcers, the leaking coffin, the stench of rot, can all be traced back to that single crash in the tilt-yard. The king who once believed himself invincible discovered that flesh and bone had limits. And from that day, he became a ruler who demanded control of everyone else, because he could no longer control himself. In Henry VIII's last decade, the king's body became a laboratory for Tudor medicine. His physicians, armed with the knowledge of Galen, medieval herbalism, and trial and error remedies, fought to manage a sovereign whose ailments overwhelmed their skill. His swollen body and ulcerated legs demanded constant intervention, and the treatments themselves often deepened his torment. The king's chambers at Whitehall and Hampton Court smelled not only of rot, but of ointments, herbs, and chemicals. Physicians prepared ointments of honey, resin, and vinegar to dress his sores, hoping their antiseptic qualities would counter infection. They applied poultices of ground herbs, marshmallow for inflammation, plantain for cleansing, and myrrh for odor. The bandages were changed daily, sometimes several times, because the ulcers leaked continually. Attendants described how the wrappings turned black within hours, forcing more layers to be applied. Beyond topical remedies, physicians turned to invasive procedures. The ulcers were repeatedly lanced and cauterized, a brutal method in which the wounds were cut open to drain bad humors, and then seared with a heated iron or corrosive chemicals to prevent regrowth. The theory was rooted in balancing the body's 4 humors, but in practice, these procedures only added agony. Infection returned again and again. Undeterred by fire and knife, pain relief was primitive. Opium-based concoctions existed but were rare, expensive, and often avoided because they clouded the mind. Henry could not afford mental dullness when signing decrees and dictating policy. Instead, his physicians relied on wine owl and herbal sedatives, balm chamomile and valerian. These dulled his suffering only briefly. Most nights, the king endured without rest, his ulcers throbbing while attendants rubbed his swollen legs with oil in vain attempts to soothe him. Diet was another battlefield. Tudor theory insisted that food determined humoral balance. Physicians urged moderation: more boiled fruits, fewer roasted meats, lighter broths instead of heavy pies. Yet Henry demanded the meals he craved: red meat, sweet confections, and strong wine. His cooks could disguise no dish well enough to deceive him, and when ordered to restrict his diet, he flew into rage. His physicians could recommend, but they could not enforce. Bloodletting remained a common prescription. Believing that excess blood contributed to his fevers and swelling, doctors used leeches or lancets to draw off pints at a time. For a man already weakened by infection and obesity, this only compounded exhaustion. Yet each relapse brought another round of bleeding, because the medical consensus insisted it must restore balance. The physicians also experimented with mercurial ointments and arsenical salves, potent chemicals meant to burn away infection. Applied directly to his legs, these caused excruciating pain. The caustic substances may have temporarily cleaned tissue, but they damaged healthy flesh alongside the infected. The result was a cycle of treatment and worsening, new wounds layered atop old ulcers. Even the royal apothecary, one of the finest in Europe, could not provide what Henry truly needed: antibiotics, surgical precision, and an understanding of metabolic disease. Instead, his cupboards brimmed with syrups of roses, powders of ivory, and draughts of gold leaf, remedies that promised much but delivered little. Each preparation was steeped in tradition and symbolism, but none could arrest the spread of rot in the king's body. Medicine was also entangled with politics. The king's health was a matter of state, and physicians who failed him risked suspicion or dismissal. No one dared declare him beyond saving. Each practitioner spoke cautiously, promising improvement even when decline was obvious. To admit failure was to risk royal wrath. Thus Henry was subjected to endless cycles of poultices, bleedings, and cauteries, not because they worked, but because physicians could not admit defeat to a sovereign who demanded solutions. The psychological effect was corrosive. Henry alternated between hope and despair, latching onto new remedies with brief optimism, then sinking into fury when pain returned. Some remedies briefly improved circulation, warm compresses, herbal baths, but the relief faded. His distrust grew. By the end, he dismissed physicians as often as he summoned them, berating them for incompetence. Yet he had no choice but to endure their hands, because without constant tending, the ulcers threatened to kill him outright. Contemporary observers recorded the spectacle with unease. Ambassadors noted that audiences with the king often reeked of corruption beneath perfumes and incense. Servants whispered of nightly screams when cauterization was applied. What they saw was not the majesty of Tudor medicine, but its limits, laid bare on the body of the most powerful man in England. Ultimately, Tudor medicine failed Henry not because his physicians were negligent, but because their world lacked the tools to treat him. They understood disease as imbalance, not infection. They relied on bleeding, burning, and purging because those were the instruments available. Against obesity, diabetes, and infected ulcers, such methods were useless. The king's body was collapsing under conditions no herb or leech could reverse. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry's medical chamber resembled a battlefield more than a healing room. Bandages stacked like spent ammunition, salves and powders like alchemical experiments, and physicians exhausted by the futility of their work. His body was not cured, it was managed, tortured, and propped up until it could endure no more. The prescriptions of desperation reveal the raw truth: Henry VIII did not simply die of disease. He died of the failures of an age, when medicine could only stab at symptoms, never the cause. His rotting body exposed the limits of Tudor science, and his screams testified to the agony of a king who learned too late that no crown could purchase a cure. By January 1547, the question in Whitehall was no longer whether Henry would die, but how he would die. For a king who had defied the Pope, shattered monasteries, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, the ritual of dying was not a private matter. It was a statement of faith, of legitimacy, of the dynasty's future. Yet as his body failed, silence thickened around the chamber. Even to speak of death before the king was treasonous. No one dared ask outright, would Henry VIII face the end with confession and last rites, or would he defy tradition in death as he had in life? The Tudor court was steeped in ritual. Monarchs were expected to make peace with God in their final hours, to confess sins, receive absolution, take the Eucharist, and commend their souls to heaven. But Henry's reign had ripped those customs apart. He had rejected papal authority, dissolved the monasteries, and executed men and women for clinging to Rome. In their place, he erected a precarious new order, half Catholic in practice, half Protestant in theology. Now on his deathbed, which rites applied to him, the atmosphere was suffocating. Courtiers knew the king's temper. To suggest confession was to admit he was dying. Physicians muttered around him, servants whispered outside, but no one dared break the silence. At last, Sir Anthony Denny, his groom of the stool and one of the few trusted to speak bluntly, is said to have whispered the truth. "Your Majesty must prepare, for you are near the end." It was a dangerous sentence, but the veil had to be pierced. Henry's response is uncertain. Chroniclers disagree. Some say he asked for comfort, others that he remained grim and silent. What is known is that Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, architect of England's Protestant reforms and Henry's longtime servant, was summoned to his bedside, but even Cranmer arrived too late to administer the full rituals of last confession and Eucharist. By the time he reached Whitehall, Henry could no longer speak. The famous story that follows comes from Protestant sources. Cranmer knelt beside the dying king, urging him to place his trust in Christ. Henry could not respond with words. Instead, according to the account, he squeezed Cranmer's hand as a sign of faith. For reformers, this became proof that Henry died in evangelical conviction, rejecting papal sacraments and affirming salvation by faith alone. For Catholics, the tale was scandalous, evidence that the king who had torn them from Rome died without true absolution, his soul unshriven. The ambiguity was deliberate. Cranmer and others ensured that the official record framed Henry's death as peaceful and orthodox enough to avoid scandal, yet Protestant enough to signal reform. But the silences are glaring. There is no detailed liturgy, no account of the Eucharist given, no priestly absolution recorded. For a monarch whose reign had convulsed Christendom, his death left behind only questions. Why did Henry not receive the full rites? Some argue that he refused, clinging to pride until speech deserted him. Others suggest he was physically incapable, struck down by weakness before formalities could be performed. Another view is political caution. To bring in priests openly might suggest dependence on Rome, undercutting the supremacy he had claimed for 2 decades. Whatever the reason, the absence was striking. Tudor England watched a king die without the traditional rites that had guided his ancestors into eternity. The silence in the chamber grew heavier after his last breath on the 28th of January 1547. Courtiers, still terrified, did not announce his death immediately. His body was sealed away, and the boy, King Edward, was quietly moved into position. Yet whispers spread quickly the king had died without confession, without Eucharist, without the rituals that ensured a soul's safe passage. For some, this was divine justice. The man who had destroyed abbeys and martyrs now went to God without absolution. For others, it was political theater, crafted to show that England's king stood apart, owing nothing to Rome even at death. The theological ambiguity shaped Henry's reputation as much as his political acts. Protestants later celebrated his deathbed hand, squeeze as symbolic. Henry died as a believer in justification by faith, not ritual. Catholics condemned it as tragedy. Henry, like Ahab, perished unrepentant, rotting in body and soul. The absence of clear rites allowed both sides to claim his death as proof of their truth. For Henry himself, the silence was fitting. He had spent his reign navigating between faiths, excommunicated by Rome yet never fully Protestant. His body collapsed in contradictions, draped in velvet yet stinking of infection, wrapped in ceremony yet denied the very rituals he once enforced. His death mirrored his reign, violent, ambiguous, and contested. The room where Henry died was not filled with hymns or incense, but with whispers, fear, and the smell of corruption. Cranmer's hand was the last touch he acknowledged. No crown, no pope, no sacraments, just the grip of a loyal servant and the void beyond. The morning of 28th of January 1547 was thick with dread inside Whitehall Palace. The king who had once terrified Europe now lay in silence, swollen, wheezing, and barely conscious. His courtiers knew it, the end had come, yet they also knew this was no ordinary death. This was the death of Henry VIII, Lord of England, breaker of Rome, executioner of queens. How does such a man leave the world? The answer, whispered behind drawn curtains, was with more fear and secrecy than triumph. When Henry finally drew his last breath, there were no trumpets, no final oration. There was only the heavy stillness of attendants who dared not move until the truth settled upon them: England's Colossus was dead. A man who once commanded armies and crushed kingdoms ended without ceremony, his body collapsing into itself like a fortress crumbling from within. His chest fell, his eyes dulled, and his swollen frame slackened. For a moment no one spoke. To declare the king's death aloud was to trigger a political earthquake. The silence was strategic. England's next ruler, Edward VIII, was only 9 years old. His regency was already contested, with factions of ambitious nobles poised to seize control. If news of Henry's death leaked too soon, chaos could erupt. Power plays, street unrest, foreign opportunism. So the first act of the king's death was concealment. The body was sealed in its chamber. Courtiers slipped out with controlled faces, whispering nothing of the truth. Outside Whitehall, Londoners still assumed their king lived. Inside, the corpse was prepared. It was an impossible task. Henry's immense weight, estimated at nearly 400 pounds, made lifting and handling a logistical nightmare. His ulcers had left his body fragile, leaking, and unstable. The royal embalmers, already familiar with the limitations of Tudor practice, worked quickly packing herbs, spices, and cloth into his body to slow decay. But there was only so much they could do. Unlike leaner monarchs embalmed with relative ease, Henry's bulk and infections accelerated decomposition. Within hours, the body was already betraying them. The room stank of corruption. Attendants covered their faces with cloths, perfumed with lavender and rosemary. Bowls of burning incense filled the chamber. It was a futile disguise. Everyone knew the odor of death, and here it mixed with the lingering stench of infected ulcers. No crown, no silk, no fur could mask what Henry VIII had become in the final moments, a carcass. Yet the rituals of monarchy had to continue. Heralds were summoned to design the proclamation of death, but the message was delayed. For 3 days, the fiction of a living king was maintained, while the Privy Council arranged the transfer of power to Edward. During that interlude, Henry's body remained in Whitehall, a rotting secret at the heart of the kingdom. Courtiers stepped lightly around the chamber, speaking in low voices, waiting for the machinery of succession to catch up with the fact of mortality. When the death was finally announced, it was presented as dignified, orderly, and serene. Official proclamation spoke of the king passing into God's grace, leaving behind a peaceful heir. The reality, ulcers leaking, embalmers panicking, courtiers silencing rumors, was buried with him. The public was told what it needed to believe: Henry died a king, majestic and unbroken. But those who were in the room knew otherwise. They had seen the body swell, smelled the rot, heard the labored gasps. They had seen attendants struggle to lift him, sweat pouring down their brows as they heaved a monarch whose body was too heavy to be managed by dignity alone. They had heard whispers about whether his soul had been shriven, whether his last rites had been incomplete, and they had felt the chill of fear when the final breath left the man who once ruled them with terror. Henry VIII's death did not erase his presence. If anything, the corpse amplified it. His body, massive and unstable, was a problem the living had to solve: how to transport it, how to display it, how to prevent it from betraying itself. The very flesh of the king threatened to undo the image of authority he had spent his life constructing. No embalmer's tools, no royal proclamations could disguise the fact that England's most commanding monarch had become a decomposing liability. For his enemies, this was poetic justice. The man who executed Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and countless martyrs ended not in glory, but in stench and secrecy. For his supporters, it was a bitter irony: the most magnificent prince of Europe, once described as the very image of Apollo, reduced to a bloated ruin hidden behind perfumed curtains. That morning in Whitehall marked not only the death of Henry VIII, but the exposure of monarchy itself. Stripped of ceremony, it revealed the truth: no crown can conceal. Power dies like any other man, sweating, gasping, leaking into cloth. The myth of Henry the Great expired in that room. What remained was a problem of flesh, to be hauled through England in a coffin that would soon betray him again. From Whitehall, Henry's corpse was to be carried westward in solemn procession toward its resting place at Windsor. The journey was meant to project majesty. Even in death, heralds in black, banners of royal arms, the coffin borne on carriages lined with velvet. Yet within days, what was planned as a spectacle of power became a grotesque warning. At Sion Abbey, the king's body betrayed him. Sion was no ordinary halt. Once a house of nuns dissolved by Henry himself, it had been seized and reshaped in his ruthless war on the church. Now, in bitter irony, His coffin paused there on its way to burial. It was in these shadowed walls, according to chroniclers, that the body began to leak. The lead coffin, hastily sealed and already strained by the king's immense bulk, could not contain the fluids of decomposition. Overnight, liquid seeped onto the floor beneath, staining the pavement. Servants discovered the mess at dawn. They cleaned it quickly, but whispers spread faster than they could mop. What spilled from the coffin was no ordinary leakage. It was the failure of a royal corpse to remain contained. For a man who had spent decades commanding control over others, his own body now defied him even in death. The legend that followed made the scene unforgettable. Chroniclers later claimed that dogs, strays lurking in the abbey precincts, came in the night and licked the seepage. To the faithful, this was more than an accident. It was prophecy fulfilled. Years earlier, the Franciscan friar William Pitot had dared to confront Henry directly. Preaching before him, Pitot compared the king to Ahab, the biblical monarch condemned for tyranny. He warned Henry that, like Ahab, his blood would be licked by dogs. At the time, Henry had dismissed the sermon with fury. Now, at Sion, the story claimed the prophecy came true, the mighty king's remains reduced to a leaking shell, his fluids consumed by scavenging beasts. Historians note that the tale of the dog likely grew in the retelling. Contemporary reports confirm that the coffin leaked, but the caning detail appears more clearly in later sources, embroidered for moral effect. Yet the persistence of the story reveals its power. In a culture steeped in prophecy, allegory, and divine judgment, Henry's leaking coffin became more than a failure of embalming. It was divine justice. The symbolism was irresistible. Here was the monarch who destroyed monasteries, executed abbots, and mocked friars, now lying in dishonor in the ruins of one of those very houses. Here was the king who claimed supremacy over the church, reduced to an object lesson in mortality, his flesh-feeding animals. The prophecy's fulfillment made his death not just a biological fact but a cosmic statement. Kings, too, wrought. For courtiers who accompanied the convoy, the incident was terrifying. They had a duty to maintain dignity, to keep the image of majesty intact. Yet how could they silence whispers of dogs licking royal blood? The procession continued, the coffin resealed and draped in richer cloths, but the story traveled with them. From servant to noble, from chronicler to preacher, it spread across England. Even centuries later, antiquarians repeated the tale with relish. To Protestants, it was proof of divine providence. Henry had fulfilled God's will in breaking from Rome, but he was still judged for his sins. To Catholics, it was vindication. The destroyer of abbeys had died in disgrace, his corpse punished as his soul was damned. To both sides, the leaking coffin became a parable too powerful to ignore. The truth, stripped of legend, is grim enough. Henry's immense bulk, his festering infections, and the crude embalming techniques of the age ensured rapid decomposition. The lead coffin, never designed to withstand such pressure, simply failed. But in Tudor imagination, biology became theology. The fluids of rot became blood. The stain on the pavement became prophecy. And the scavenging dog became a symbol of divine justice devouring a tyrant. At Sion, Henry's body lost its last chance at dignity. The procession no longer projected power. It carried scandal, whispered at every halt along the road to Windsor. His subjects might not see the leaking corpse, but they heard the story, and it became part of the legend of Henry's end. The abbey, once desecrated by his hand, stood as a fitting stage for the collapse of his image. In life, Henry had made himself larger than kings. God's chosen, Rome's defier, England's master. In death, he was reduced to leaking flesh in the ruins of the house he had destroyed. The prophecy of Friar Pitot, once ridiculed, became the lens through which generations understood his fall. Sion Abbey's tale leaves us with a chilling reminder: power cannot stop decay. A crown cannot hold a coffin together. And even the most feared monarch of his age could not silence prophecy once the fluids began to seep. On the 16th of February 1547, the corpse of Henry VIII reached Windsor. After weeks of delay, secrecy, and whispered scandal, the king, who once commanded Europe's attention, was lowered into the ground at St. George's Chapel. Not into the grand monument he had long envisioned, but into a temporary vault that became his eternal resting place. It was the last humiliation for a monarch who had demanded magnificence in all things, yet found only neglect in death. Henry had spent years planning a colossal tomb. Designs were drafted under the supervision of Italian sculptors and English craftsmen. Bronze effigies, towering columns, and carved angels were ordered. At its heart was to be Henry himself, immortalized in marble, flanked by the grandeur of a dynasty that would stand for eternity. He wanted nothing less than a shrine to rival the greatest tombs of Europe. But the project stalled. Wars drained his treasury, politics consumed his attention, and his health collapsed before construction could advance. By 1547, the tomb existed only as sketches and fragments. The funeral procession that entered Windsor bore little of that imagined majesty. The heralds and clergy spoke the rites, choirs sang, banners of arms were displayed. But beneath the solemn pageantry lay a plain reality. Henry's embalmed body, sealed in a leaking lead coffin, was to be placed in a pit beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel. The temporary vault had been intended only as a stopgap until his monument was ready. Instead, it became permanent. There, in the dim vault beneath the stone floor, Henry was laid beside Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one of his 6 queens to bear him a surviving son. Edward VI. The choice of Jane was deliberate. She was the queen who had given him the heir he craved, the queen he had called his true wife. To rest beside her was meant as a statement of dynastic legitimacy. Yet the intimacy of their burial was accidental as much as intentional, for there was no grand sarcophagus, no gilded canopy, no marble effigy, just a shared pit, sealed and hidden from view. The ironies piled higher over time. The great tomb Henry ordered was never completed by his successors. Edward died too young to oversee it. Mary, a devout Catholic, had little interest in immortalizing a father who had shattered Rome's hold. Elizabeth, though she inherited his throne, poured resources into her own legacy. By the 17th century, the materials for Henry's tomb had been scattered or repurposed. The monument that was meant to immortalize him dissolved into fragments, while his body remained in obscurity under a blank slab of stone. Worse still, he would not remain alone. In 1649, more than a century after his burial, another royal corpse was lowered into the same vault. Charles I, beheaded by his own subjects during the English Civil War. The contrast could not be sharper. Henry, who embodied absolute monarchy, lay beside a king destroyed by it. Later, in 1710, a stillborn child of Queen Anne was placed in the same grave. A king, a queen, an executed monarch, and a nameless infant, all crammed into a vault never meant to hold such a company. By the 19th century, curiosity brought antiquarians to open the vault. In 1813, workmen repairing the chapel stumbled upon the site. They found Henry's massive coffin, split in places but still intact, alongside the smaller coffins of Jane and Charles. Witnesses recorded the scene with awe and unease. There was no grand effigy, no monumental sculpture, only corroded lead boxes in a damp pit, holding the remains of a king who had demanded the world bow to him. In 1837, at last, a modest black slab was laid to mark the spot. Its inscription was plain. In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry V. 1537, King Henry V. 1547, King Charles I. 1648, and an infant child of Queen Anne. 4 lives collapsed into one inscription beneath one stone. This was the grave of a monarch who once styled himself as greater than Caesar. The tomb Henry never built says as much about his reign as the palaces he raised and the monasteries he destroyed. It reveals a king consumed by appetite and ambition, who imagined himself eternal but left his corpse to obscurity. His monument collapsed under the weight of his wars and debts, just as his body collapsed under the weight of his flesh. His name endured in law and legend, but his burial site spoke only of failure. For pilgrims at Windsor, there is no towering shrine to Henry V. No visitors kneel before a marble effigy. There is only the plain slab walked over daily, unremarked by many who pass above. The man who reshaped England's church and crown lies in the dust, indistinguishable from others buried around him. In death, he became ordinary, a fate more horrifying to him than any ulcer, any wound. Henry's burial at Windsor closes the arc of his story with bitter irony. He sought grandeur, he received neglect, he imagined immortality, he was buried in silence. and the vault beneath St. George's Chapel, crowded with the bones of kings and infants alike, stands as the final proof, even monarchs who believe themselves God's end as rotting flesh beneath stone. Henry VIII's death was grotesque enough without invention, yet over the centuries, rumor and exaggeration turned his final decline into something monstrous. Chroniclers, pamphleteers, and later historians embroidered his agony with tales of venereal disease, bursting coffins, and divine curses. These stories, though colorful, reveal more about the obsessions of those who told them than about the man himself. To sift myth from fact is to uncover how even in death, Henry remained a battleground of politics and morality. The most enduring claim is that Henry died of syphilis. It has been repeated in schoolrooms, biographies, and novels for centuries. The logic was simple: syphilis, rampant in early modern Europe, caused sores, disfigurement, and madness. Henry's ulcers, obesity, and erratic temper seemed to fit the diagnosis. The theory offered a satisfying moral twist: the king who indulged in lustful excess punished by a venereal plague. But the evidence is wafer, thin. None of Henry's doctors mention mercury treatments, the standard therapy for syphilis in the 16th century. No ambassador reports it. No contemporary document links the king's ailments to the disease. Modern medical historians are blunt. There is no credible evidence that Henry ever had syphilis. His ulcers can be traced to trauma, his weight to diet and immobility, his rages to brain injury or metabolic disease. The syphilis myth survived because it suited a moral narrative. Henry, the wife killer and adulterer, deserved to rot from a sexual curse. History loves a punishment story, and so it endured. Then comes the legend of the exploding coffin. Popular accounts claim that Henry's corpse, so swollen with gases of decay, burst open during his funeral, spilling foul matter across the chapel. Some versions say this happened at Windsor, others place it earlier in the journey. The story echoes medieval tropes of tyrants whose bodies erupted in death as a sign of divine judgment. Chroniclers told similar tales about William the Conqueror and other monarchs whose burials went badly. What do the sources say? Contemporary records of Henry's funeral do not mention an explosion. They note the coffin leaking at Sion Abbey, an embarrassing enough incident, but not bursting. The explosion motif appears later, in Protestant and Catholic polemics alike, borrowing from older stories and grafting them onto Henry. It was too vivid an image to resist. The bloated tyrant's body literally tearing itself apart, a final stage for his excess. Yet the facts are plainer: his lead coffin leaked. It did not burst. The tale of bursting is literary theater, not eyewitness truth. Another legend haunts the edges of his death, that Henry died unrepentant, damned by prophecy. The Friar Peto sermon, comparing Henry to Ahab and predicting dogs would lick his blood, became the kernel for endless retellings. Some claimed that at Windsor, not just Sion, dogs broke into the vault. Others insisted worms swarmed from the coffin, another divine sign. These stories were less about medical possibility than about moral necessity. For Catholic writers, Henry had to die horribly, punished for his schism. For Protestant writers, exaggeration emphasized his humanity, a reminder that even reforming kings must face judgment. There were also medical myths beyond syphilis. Some later writers suggested scrofula, kidney failure or gangrene. Others imagined a cocktail of conditions: gout, diabetes, heart failure, layered together until his body collapsed. The problem is not that these are impossible, but that the documentary record is too thin to support precision. Tudor physicians did not leave autopsy notes, only observations of ulcers, swelling, and exhaustion. The rest is speculation. What the myths reveal is how Henry's body became propaganda. His enemies needed him diseased, damned, and disgusting to prove God's judgment. His admirers needed to explain his decline without undermining his legacy, so they either suppressed details or spiritualized them. The truth, an obese, ulcerated man dying slowly of infection, was too ordinary to satisfy the hunger for moral theater, so myth stepped in. The persistence of these tales shows how deeply Henry VIII unsettled posterity. His reign left a divided church, executed wives, and rivers of blood. No simple death could balance such a ledger. People demanded a spectacle, a punishment story, a symbol of cosmic justice. And so syphilis, Exploding coffins and dogs licking blood filled the gap left by silence in the records. In reality, Henry's death was horrifying enough without invention. He stank of infection, leaked from his coffin, and was buried without the tomb he demanded. His body collapsed under its own weight, his ulcers poisoned him from within, and his courtiers concealed his decline with incense and whispers. No prophecy, no venereal plague, no bursting theatrics were required to make his end grotesque. Yet perhaps that is why the myths endure. They provide narrative symmetry where life offered only chaos. They punish the tyrant with diseases of lust, explosions of corruption, and humiliations at the jaws of dogs. They make history into fable, where justice is always poetic. But the historian's task is harsher, to strip away the fables and confront the uglier truth, that sometimes cruelty and grandeur end not with divine punishment, but with the ordinary, grinding rot of human flesh. Henry VIII did not need syphilis to damn him. He damned himself by the lives he destroyed and the kingdom he fractured. His death, whether leaking or bursting, whether licked by dogs or hidden by incense, is remembered not because of myths, but because the man who once ruled like a god proved in the end to be nothing more than meat in a box. The death of Henry VIII has been wrapped in prophecy and propaganda, but strip away the legends and a stark medical reality emerges. His end was not the judgment of syphilis or divine explosions. It was the slow collapse of a body wrecked by injury, obesity, and infection. A modern clinical lens allows us to reconstruct the likeliest causes. The turning point was the jousting accident of 1536, which left Henry with a chronic wound in his left leg. From that moment, his body was locked into a vicious cycle. The ulcer never healed, repeatedly festering and draining foul matter. Each flare invited infection, each infection poisoned the blood. In the absence of antibiotics, this meant repeated bouts of systemic illness, what we now call sepsis. Many historians believe that his final decline in January 1547 was simply the last, fatal episode of that cycle. Beyond infection, the king's sheer size contributed to his collapse. Contemporary accounts put his weight at over 28 stone (180 kg. This was not the robust bulk of an athlete, but the swollen mass of a man immobile and chronically ill. His chest heaved under the pressure of fat compressing his lungs. Breathing at night was difficult, likely sleep apnea, leaving him exhausted and oxygen deprived. His heart, forced to pump through layers of tissue and inflamed vessels, was overworked. Congestive heart failure is a likely companion to the sepsis that marked his final months. Modern clinicians point to signs of type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. His thirst, slow wound healing, obesity, and lethargy fit the profile. Diabetes would have compounded his ulcer problem, preventing tissue from repairing and making infection inevitable. Combined with rich Tudor diets heavy in sugar and meat, Henry's metabolic system was primed for breakdown. Other conditions may have layered on. His erratic moods, rages, and paranoia after 1536 suggest frontal lobe damage from head trauma. While not fatal, this neurological injury destabilized his behavior and perhaps impaired decision-making about his own care. His physicians could propose dietary restraint, but a man with brain trauma, unchecked appetite, and supreme power was unlikely to comply. What about kidney failure or liver disease? The swollen legs, described as dropsy in Tudor accounts, suggest fluid retention, a symptom of both heart and kidney dysfunction. Years of heavy alcohol and rich food would have strained his liver, but the ulcers and infections point more strongly to systemic sepsis than cirrhosis as the final blow. The kidneys may have been failing, but they were part of a broader collapse, not the primary cause. So what killed him? The likeliest sequence is this. Chronic ulceration provided a constant entry point for infection. By the 1540s, his obesity, diabetes, and immobility ensured those infections became systemic. His failing heart and kidneys could not withstand the strain of repeated sepsis. In January 1547, the balance tipped. Overwhelming infection, heart failure, and organ collapse converged. There was no single disease of kings here. Henry VIII died of the compounded failures of his body, accelerated by an accident, aggravated by his appetites, and untreated because 16th century medicine had no answers. His body was not cursed, but predictable, the outcome of trauma, indulgence, and primitive health care. The grotesque details, the stench, the leaking coffin, the swelling flesh, were symptoms of decomposition accelerated by the very conditions that killed him. Infection does not stop at death, it transforms the body into a pressurized shell. That was Henry's last humiliation. His body, once the symbol of majesty, became the proof of decay. The clinical verdict is sobering. Henry VIII died not of syphilis or divine wrath, but of what modern doctors would call chronic, uncontrolled sepsis in a patient with morbid obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart failure. His reign collapsed into the same biology that governs us all, the limits of human flesh. The death of Henry VIII created two problems: the body and the kingdom. Both were unstable, both threatened to erupt, and both had to be contained. For his counselors, concealing the collapse of the monarch's flesh was inseparable from concealing the vulnerability of the Tudor state. In January 1547, embalming and politics became indistinguishable. The body itself was a liability. At nearly 400 pounds, ulcer-ridden and swollen, Henry's corpse decomposed faster than his embalmers could manage. Tudor embalming relied on evisceration, spices, and sealing in lead, but this was crude science. His bulk and infections generated gases that strained the coffin. The odor, unmistakable, seeped through even as attendants burned incense and scattered herbs. What should have been a solemn relic of kingship was instead a rotting reminder of mortality. Yet the political stakes demanded control. A boy of 9, Edward VI, was now king. The Regency Council needed time to consolidate power. If rumors spread that Henry had died in squalor, leaking unshriven, abandoned, the image of Tudor authority would falter. So secrecy cloaked Whitehall. His death was not announced for 3 days. The corpse was hidden behind curtains, his chamber sealed, while proclamations were drafted and succession arranged. Even the procession was designed as theater against the stench. When the coffin left Whitehall, it was draped in black velvet, flanked by heralds and banners of royal arms. No one was to see the swelling lead box beneath. The reek was masked with burning torches, perfumes, and choirs' chants. The pageantry shouted continuity. England's crown remained strong. Behind the chants, courtiers knew the truth. The king was falling apart inside his shell. Managing the smell was managing legitimacy. In the 16th century, bodily corruption was not just unpleasant, it was a moral verdict. A rotting corpse could be read as divine judgment, proof of damnation. To admit the king's body was failing was to admit his soul might be condemned. For reformers and Catholics alike, such imagery could be weaponized. Thus, every cloth, every incense burner, every carefully staged herald was part of statecraft. The odor of decomposition had to be drowned in the scent of authority. Secrecy also extended to ritual. Henry had died without clear last rites, leaving dangerous ambiguity about his spiritual state. The council avoided details, crafting announcements that framed his passing as peaceful and dignified. No mention of Cranmer's rushed hand squeeze. No hint of doubt. The proclamations portrayed him as a king departing in grace, a father of his people, leaving a healthy heir. Truth was not the priority, stability was. At Sion Abbey, when the coffin leaked, this balancing act collapsed. The seepage was physical, undeniable, and impossible to hide. Servants whispered, chroniclers embroidered, and prophecy was recalled. The council responded with silence, doubling down on pageantry as the body was revealed. The lesson was grim but clear: if flesh could not be contained, narrative must. The same logic governed the burial at Windsor. Henry was lowered quietly into a vault with Jane Seymour, without the grand monument he had imagined. The modest ceremony ensured efficiency and containment. The absence of a completed tomb meant there was no opportunity for long exposure of the corpse, no public relics, no chance for scandal. The king who had demanded spectacle in life was buried with understatement in death. Because understatement was safer, the handling of Henry's body shows how closely monarchy fused flesh and state. A rotting king threatened more than noses. It threatened dynastic survival. His counselors acted not as caretakers of a corpse, but as guardians of myth. They embalmed as much with words as with spices, sealing decay beneath layers of ceremony. The secrecy worked, at least on the surface. England moved forward under Edward VI, the regency secured for the moment. But memory preserved the whispers. The leaking coffin at Sion, the stench at Whitehall, the hidden corpse, All remained in circulation, undermining the official script. No velvet drape or perfumed censer could erase the truth. Henry VIII, who once ruled like a god, ended as a liability to be hidden, perfumed, and hurried into the ground. In the end, the management of Henry's corpse was the management of monarchy itself. The state could not allow the king's body to rot in public. The smell was more than physical, it was political. If the king stank of corruption, so did his dynasty. And so for 3 weeks in 1547, England's rulers burned incense, proclaimed dignity, and marched banners to drown the truth. Their colossus had collapsed into filth. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547, but his death did not end his presence. If anything, the grotesque nature of his decline gave his reputation a second life. For the Tudors who followed, for Catholic polemicists abroad, and for Protestant chroniclers at home, the leaking coffin and unshriven soul became symbols to be shaped, retold, and wielded. His body had failed, but his reputation remained a battlefield. The immediate Tudor narrative was carefully curated. Edward VI's Regency Council issued proclamations portraying Henry as a pious monarch departing in peace, his succession secured, his kingdom strong. The official chronicles emphasized majesty, omitting any mention of ulcers, stench, or secrecy. To admit decay would be to undermine legitimacy. Thus the state memory embalmed him with dignity, burying the truth alongside his body. But beyond official channels, a darker story circulated. Ambassadors whispered in dispatches about the stench of Whitehall and the rumors of Sion Abbey. Catholic exiles seized on these tales as proof of divine judgment. Friar Pedo's prophecy, dogs licking royal blood, was repeated in sermons across Europe, cast as evidence that God had struck England's tyrant down. In Catholic memory, Henry died not as a king but as a heretic punished in flesh and soul. Protestant writers, by contrast, reinterpreted his end to suit reformist agendas. Cranmer's hand squeeze was framed as a confession of faith, proof that Henry died trusting in Christ alone. They minimized ritual ambiguity and emphasized his role in breaking Rome's stranglehold. For them, the leaking coffin was less divine judgment than a reminder of human mortality. Even kings rot, and salvation comes only by faith. In this retelling, Henry's decline became a cautionary tale, not of heresy, but of worldly vanity. The 17th century gave his death new resonance. When Charles I was executed in 1649, royalists pointed to the irony that his body was laid beside Henry's at Windsor. Henry, who had elevated monarchy to godlike heights, now shared a vault with a king struck down by his people. Republicans, meanwhile, revived old stories of Henry's bloated corpse as evidence that tyranny always ends in corruption. His grave became a stage on which new battles about monarchy and liberty were fought. By the 18th and 19th centuries, antiquarians returned to the vault itself. In 1813, workmen accidentally opened it, finding Henry's coffin corroded but intact. They reported the massive dimensions of the lead casing, confirming what history already suspected: his body had been as immense in death as in life. The discovery reignited public fascination, blending curiosity with horror. Victorians, obsessed with moral lessons, revived tales of syphilis and gluttony, turning Henry's death into a parable about excess and divine retribution. Literature and popular history cemented these images. In Protestant England, Henry remained the bold king who severed papal chains. In Catholic Europe, he lingered as the tyrant who died stinking, his body consumed by rot. Myths about syphilis, bursting coffins, and worm-infested corpses persisted because they offered narrative justice. History rarely punishes tyrants neatly, but legend can. Yet modern historians, examining medical evidence, dismantle the myths while acknowledging their symbolic power. Henry did not explode, nor is there proof of syphilis. His coffin leaked, yes, but only because his immense bulk and crude embalming strained Tudor techniques. The truth is less spectacular but more damning. A king destroyed not by divine lightning, but by his own body and the failures of his age's medicine. His afterlife in memory demonstrates a deeper truth, that people require tyrants to die symbolically, not just physically. Even today, Henry's reputation is filtered through his death. Popular documentaries linger on the ulcers, the stench, the leaking coffin. The fascination lies not only in the grotesque details, but in what they reveal: the collapse of a man who once ruled like a god. His death humanizes him, stripping away majesty and exposing flesh. Yet it also magnifies his legacy, because the more horrifying his end, the more memorable his reign becomes. The afterlife of Henry VII's reputation is thus twofold. In fact, he died of infection, obesity, and organ failure hidden behind curtains. In memory, he died of syphilis, prophecy, and divine wrath. The gap between fact and legend reveals the human need for poetic justice. And Henry, who spent his life crafting his own image, would have raged to see it undone by puss, prophecy, and myth. Henry VII's reign reshaped England, but his death stripped it bare. No battle, no decree, no marriage defined him more than the spectacle of his own collapse. The body that once thundered across tilt yards and filled Holbein's portraits with majesty ended rotting, leaking, and hidden behind incense. In this final reckoning, Henry became the clearest example of a truth his courtiers feared to say aloud: kings die like men, and tyranny leaves no shield against flesh. The symbolism was inescapable. Here was a monarch who destroyed monasteries, executed wives, and demanded obedience as if he were ordained above law itself. Yet his body defied him. The ulcers he could not conquer, the bulk he could not master, the coffin he could not contain. These were rebellions more profound than any subject's defiance. His own flesh betrayed him, proving that no crown could stop the rod of time. Prophecy sharpened the sting. Friar Peto's warning that dogs would lick his blood like a habs clung to his legend. Whether fact or invention, it became the lens through which generations interpreted his end. To Catholics, it was divine punishment. To Protestants, a reminder of human frailty. To all, it was a story too fitting to ignore. The king who claimed supremacy over church and state was reduced to a leaking shell in an abbey he had desecrated. His power ended not in triumph, but in irony. The absence of a tomb magnified the humiliation. Henry had imagined a monument of bronze and marble, angels and triumphs, rivaling the shrines of emperors. Instead, he was left in a plain vault beneath the stones of St. George's Chapel, sharing space with a queen, an executed king, and a nameless infant. His grand vision dissolved into neglect, as though history itself conspired to bury his vanity with his body. What, then, did his death mean for England? Politically, it exposed fragility. His only male heir was a child, his council was divided, his reforms were unfinished. Spiritually, it left ambiguity. He died without clear confession, leaving Protestants and Catholics to claim him for their cause. Biologically, it revealed the limitations of his age: medicine unable to treat ulcers, diet unchecked by knowledge, disease accelerated by indulgence. The king who demanded control in all things died where control was impossible. For posterity, Henry's death is remembered less as a medical event than as a moral parable. His leaking coffin, his bloated frame, his unfinished tomb, all serve as symbols of excess, pride, and the futility of power. History granted him no clean exit. Instead, it locked him into a narrative of corruption, one as physical as it was spiritual. Yet perhaps this is the truest legacy Henry VIII could leave. His reign was built on contradictions: a defender of faith who shattered Christendom, a lover of glory who ended in decay, a builder of dynasties who left his line fragile. His death embodied those contradictions perfectly. It was both ordinary and extraordinary, ordinary in its biology, extraordinary in its symbolism. The final reckoning is simple, brutal, and undeniable. Henry VIII died of infection, obesity, and organ failure. His coffin leaked because lead could not contain him. His reputation leaked because myth could not resist him. He sought immortality through power, but history remembered his decay. And so his story closes not with marble and triumph, but with stench, secrecy, and prophecy. Henry VIII, the monarch who believed himself more than a man, was proven at last to be nothing else. His body lies beneath stone at Windsor, but his true tomb is the memory of his death, a warning carved into history that flesh conquers kings and rot humbles empires. Power, glory, crowns, and fear could not save Henry VIII from the one enemy no monarch escapes: his own flesh. In the end, the man who defied Rome and reshaped England was undone by rot, stench, and silence. His leaking coffin and forgotten tomb remain a warning carved into history, proof that even kings die like men, and tyranny leaves only decay. If you want more of history's darkest truths, uncensored, brutal, and stripped of myth, subscribe now. because this is where history bleeds, and where the horrors buried in time are finally unearthed.